Hey, what's going on guys? Welcome back to another Eidolon Hunting video. Today's video is going to be going over Chroma, his role in the fight, and my personal Chroma build. Chroma is definitely the go-to damage Warframe for most Eidolon hunts, and that's all because of Chroma's 3 Vex Armor. Vex Armor will give you and nearby teammates a damage multiplier based on your ability strength, which for this build is going to be about 800% damage. Now before we talk about Chroma, we really need to talk about Vex Armor, because its damage increase is pretty misleading. And what I mean by that is that Chroma's Vex Armor won't work with plus damage mods like Serration or Heavy Caliber. You may find this understandably confusing, and it is. But basically, Vex Armor works like a second Serration on your weapon. This doesn't mean that Serration won't increase your damage, it's just that the damage that Serration gives you won't then be scaled again by Vex Armor. Which means that by putting a 90% elemental mod in a weapon, you're going to gain more damage while the Vex Armor buff is active. However, if you don't have your Vex Armor buff active, then Serration will overtake a 90% elemental mod for pure damage. But for the Eidolons, we're going to assume we always have Vex Armor up, meaning that we're going to want 90% elemental damage mods, or if you have access to it, a Prime Cryo on your weapon instead of mods like Heavy Caliber or Serration. And remember, we're only doing this because of how fucked Vex Armor's damage calculation is. But as you'll see when I shoot a target with Serration and Heavy Caliber, versus when I shoot a target with elemental mods, the elemental mods deal more damage in total to the target. So the Serration and Heavy Caliber version deals about 80,000 damage, and the elemental mod version deals about 104,000 damage. Now, this is a good time to talk about something I missed during my armor stripping video, and that is that radiation damage will ignore 75% of the Eidolon's current armor, making radiation damage the best damage type while the Eidolon still has its full armor value. You still want to strip as much armor off as possible, it's just that radiation damage will deal more damage to the Eidolon while it still has armor. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because while using other elemental mods on Chroma, like for this build where I'm using Prime Cryo rounds, you want to strip as much armor off as possible because you're not going to ignore 75% of the Eidolon's armor like radiation damage will. And on top of radiation damage ignoring the Eidolon's armor, it will also deal more than 75% damage to them because they have robotic health. This is another thing I was unaware of before posting the video, and that is that the health type underneath the armor will also affect the damage you're dealing to a target. This is going to be different for every enemy, but the basic version is for the Eidolons, you're going to be dealing roughly 40% more damage to the Eidolons simply because they have robotic health, which is weak to radiation damage. However, the exact percentage of damage will be affected by how much total armor the Eidolons currently have. If you want to figure out this percentage for other enemies, or the Eidolons themselves, you can use this formula, which can be found on the Damage 2.0 article on the wiki, which I'll leave a link to in the description. I do apologize for any confusion about this. If you watched my armor stripping video, the information in that video is not incorrect, it's just less correct than this. And I missed this while making the video, so I do apologize. But basically the thing you should take away from it is that radiation damage is just the best damage type you can possibly get. And cold is decent because we are getting a plus 25% bonus. But let's get back to talking about Chroma. Like I showed earlier, you're going to get a significant difference in damage when you're using regular damage mods versus the elemental mods. And the reason for this is how the Vex Armor damage formula works. The calculation on the wiki is a little misleading because it doesn't actually show you how the elemental mods work with Vex Armor in the example given. But basically what you do is take the weapon's base damage, which in Lanka's case is 525, and then you multiply that by 1 plus basic damage mods like Serration or Heavy Caliber, and then you add to that the Fury modifier, which is always 2.75, times your Chroma's strength, which in this build is 299%. So at this point we've basically taken the weapon's base damage and multiplied it by your Fury modifier plus any other damage mods you have, and then after this whole calculation is complete, you then multiply the final result by the elemental mods. Which is why elemental mods will increase your damage more than mods like Serration or Heavy Caliber will, because they affect the overall formula instead of one tiny piece. I have no idea how anybody is supposed to know this without checking the wiki or testing it for themselves. But there it is, that's how Vex Armor currently works, after they fixed it. If you have any questions about this, please leave a comment below. And you can check the Chroma section of the wiki to see the Vex Armor formula for both armor and damage in full. But here I'm only going to focus on the damage part, and I'll leave a link to that below. Alright, so now that that confusing mess is out of the way, let's take a look at Chroma himself. For Chroma's build, you basically just want strength and duration. Here I have a little bit of efficiency just to make it easier to cast my Vex Armor, but really the strength and duration are your main priorities. So to get my strength up as high as possible, I'm running Blind Rage, Transient Fortitude, Intensify, and Power Drift. And for my duration mods, I'm running Constitution, Continuity, and Narrow-Minded. Narrow-Minded gives us negative ability range, and here we don't really care about giving our teammates the damage buff. This build is relying on Chroma alone to take down the Eidolon's Synovas and the Eidolon itself. So range is not a huge priority here since we're being pretty selfish with the damage. And you also want to be running Vitality for survivability, especially because we're going to be taking self-damage to get our Vex Armor buff. Here I'm running Streamline just to make sure my efficiency isn't horribly negative, but you could also swap in something like Fleeting Expertise if you want to, but that will decrease your duration, so it's kind of a balancing act. Honestly, I find running one Streamline here perfectly fine, but it will depend on how you're playing Chroma. And if you want to, you can also put another strength mod in here, but I don't find I need the extra damage. Which brings me to my aura. Here I'm running Corrosive Projection, but you could also run something like Deadeye or Enemy Radar to help find Vombalists. It'll just depend on what your teammates are running. Remember, we really want to strip the Eidolon's armor down, so running something like Corrosive Projection could be important for boosting your damage. And if you haven't seen it, I have a whole video going over armor stripping for Eidolons, which I'll link to above. And then as for my Arcanes here, I'm running Arcane Nullifiers just to give me that 100% magnetic proc resistance. Chroma is one of the few frames in the fight where the weapons you're running are very important. I've already talked about my Lanka build and why I built it for elemental damage. But his secondary and melee weapons are also very important because they'll allow you to do self-damage to Chroma to get his Vex Armor buff. To accomplish this, you have two main options. One is running a thrown secondary with the Concealed Explosives mod, which has a chance for your projectiles to explode upon impact, meaning that you can just throw your secondary at the ground in front of you to damage yourself with the explosions. To accomplish this, all you need is multi-shot and fire rate. That's it. You don't need like damage mods or anything else because they're not going to scale with the explosion damage. So for my build, I'm just running Concealed Explosives, Barrel Diffusion, Lethal Torrent, Gunslinger, and Anemic Agility. And you could really copy this to any other thrown projectile that Concealed Explosives works on. Personally for Chroma, I prefer running a thrown secondary, simply because it allows you to run a Sarpa in your melee slot to strip the Eidolon's armor, which again I went over in my stripping armor video. And remember, because we're not running pure radiation damage here, having the extra armor strip is going to be pretty important if you're not running in a full squad with 3 corrosive projections. But if you don't need the extra armor strip, there are two options you can run here. One is the Glaive, and the other is the Serrata. Personally, I prefer running the Serrata because it won't knock you back on impact, as well as the fact that it deals innate toxin damage which will bypass your shields, and deal it directly to your health, which is what we want for the Vex Armor buff. But both weapons are viable options. And to get them to work, all you need to do is hold your quick melee button down and aim at your feet, which will then damage you and get your Vex Armor buff up. If you're having trouble getting it in one hit, play around with the damage because you don't want to be throwing your melee twice to get that damage buff. But the bare bones of what you need are Power Throw, Quick Return, and Fever Strike. Depending on how good your self-damage is, you might also need a mod like Pressure Point or Virulent Scourge to get that extra self-damage, and the important part of this is that you're dealing toxin damage which will bypass your shields, making it so you're taking as much damage as possible to your health. And then after you have enough damage, you basically just want as much attack speed as possible. So here I'm running Prime Fury with Gladiator Vice to give me an extra 85% attack speed, which just lets me get my buff up faster. Personally, I find using the thrown secondary method more consistent and convenient, but using the glaives will be faster overall if you have the right amount of damage. And if you want to, you can also run a Decaying Dragon Key, which will reduce your total shields from 300 to 75, allowing you to get your Fury buff up faster. As for your companion, you're going to want the Adarza Kavat with the Cat's Eye buff. And if you're playing Chroma for the fight, chances are you're going to be going Unairu. And the reason we're going Unairu here over Maturai is because while you're shooting at the Eidolon, you don't want to be wasting your Void Strike stacks. And since the Chroma player should always be the one shooting, they're going to be the one putting down the Unairu Wisps instead of charging Void Strike while they're not shooting. That way you're not wasting unnecessary stacks on the Eidolon, and you're also boosting your Void Strike users' damage by putting down Wisps for them. But now that I've talked about the build, let's look at some Chroma gameplay. I'm definitely not the most experienced Chroma player, mostly because during the fights I'm playing one of the other roles, but typically if you're going to be the Chroma player, you're probably going to want to be host and charge that first lure, which I went over in my lure tricks video, and is what you see me doing here. For me as Chroma, I found it easiest to get your Fury buff up once and then keep it up throughout the entire hunt. This is where having energy gain like energy pads or having an Arcane Energize can be beneficial to keep up your buff for the fight, especially since Vex Armor is going to have a very high energy cost. And part of the reason I like keeping the buff up once I have it is because frames like Oberon, Trinity, or Harrow are going to hinder your ability to deal self-damage to yourself, meaning that getting your Fury buff later on can be a little challenging, especially if you're taking less damage or in Harrow's case, no damage at all. But once you have your Fury buff up, you just need to recast your Vex Armor once you see your Fury buff getting low, which refreshes the duration. I typically do this around 15 seconds just to make sure I don't miss my refresh, but it's really up to what you're comfortable with. and the more you refresh, the more energy it's going to cost you. I don't mind popping a pad down, but I know some people won't have that option. Other than that, you just want to make sure you're in range for Void Blast during the energy spike phase, which will put down wisps for your teammates that will double their operator damage when they pick them up, and make sure your Warframe's in a good position when the Eidolon shield goes down to pop a limb. Having a good line of sight to one of the Synovas is an important part of getting the limb down quickly, and it's definitely not something that I'm always perfect at. And of course, having a Volt on your team to put down shields, especially during the last phase, will greatly increase your damage. But I think that about covers it for Chroma. I hope it was helpful going over how Vex Armor works, because it's really weird, and it doesn't function in a common sense way. So hopefully going over that and showing why it works the way it does will help you guys understand how to mod your weapons. If you have any questions or suggestions about something I covered in the video, please leave a comment below, and I'll do my best to get back to you. And if you did find the video helpful, I'd appreciate it if you leave a like. That's going to do it for me, guys. Hope you all have a good one, and I'll see you later.